Hi guys, and welcome to another edition of Darkwood Bushcraft. We're not strictly speaking bushcrafting today in the truest sense of the word, but what we're going to have a look at instead is budget axes. Now, what I'm talking about in particular is axes that you can pick up from high street or from online retailers which are under £10. Normally what you're getting is fit and finish wise usually something pretty weak, but when you're looking at 70, 80, 90 pounds upwards for a good quality bushcraft axe, this is certainly an option that you can go for. And I'm going to show you today that with a little bit of work that you can make something really quite functional and quite good out of something like this. Okay, so what we've got here is a basic run-of-the-mill 600 gram hatchet. Like I say, you can buy these from all sorts of online vendors. This particular one I believe was from Amazon and it was about £6.50. So we're well under a tenner with something like this. It says hardwood hatchet 1.5 pounds, 0.68 kilograms. So like I say, it's a 600 gram head. It's probably an 80 gram handle. That's probably where they get that from. My best guess is that the handle is either ash or hickory, but it's got a reasonably good straight grain. There's no major runoffs. There's a little bit of runoff here, but nothing important. That's all the information you get. Everything else is about wear safety glasses, don't cut your arms and legs off, that sort of thing. It's got two hammered metal wedges in the top here to secure the head and to spread the top there and just make sure it's secure, but I do believe this is probably glued in as well because they usually are. Nonetheless, it's a very tight head. It's very secure. The blade profile this way isn't too bad. It's not that wide. It's not going to take much to thin this down and make it into something a little bit more useful for bushcraft that will carve and things like that. The edge is non-existent. You're not going to cut yourself with that ever. You'd be hard pushed to split wood with that. As it stands, it's pretty much just a splitting wedge with a handle on it at the moment. But we'll deal with that. We'll get that ground down. We'll get a really nice sharp edge on that. In my experience, these are usually somewhere in the low 50s on a Rockwell rating, so they're good tough little beasts. Once you get them up to standard, they're actually fairly good. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to reprofile the head with the grinder. You can do this on a belt sander in your vise, that works just as well. I'm going to take off all this horrible varnish and this paint, strip this handle right back, maybe scorch it, put a bit of linseed oil on it, and we'll maybe drill a lanyard hole in there. Not a huge amount of work, but let's see what we've got by the end of it. Right, first off we're going to start with the grinding and reprofiling of the head. The reason for this is just because it's probably the messiest piece, so we'll get that out of the way before we worry about getting the finish where we want it to be. The last thing you want to do is putting grubby metally fingerprints all over a nice clean wooden handle, so we're going to start with that. It's very important at this stage, whether you're using a grinder, whether you're using a belt sander or whatever you're using, that you start with a very coarse grit. This is a 36 grit belt. The reason for that is it will take off the most material while generating the least amount of heat, which is very important. If your blade gets too hot, and you'll know it's too hot because you'll get a discoloration of the metal, you will ruin the temper completely on your axe. You might as well throw it at that point, unless you've got a forge to reharden and retemper it. You've ruined the edge. So it's really important, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure you keep your axe blade cool while you're grinding it. It's quite useful to have a bowl of water or something along those lines. I have a sink behind me here which I have full of water, so that you can cool the blade down as you're working. So importantly, keep that blade cool. That's crucial. Okay, now I don't know if you can see this on camera, but you might have noticed that suddenly this tiny little thin silver line started to appear on the edge. Now that's a burr. That means that the material that's coming off the edge here is folding over because we've finally got a fine edge on here. So that's what you're looking for. We haven't got one at the top part here yet because we haven't quite, this is still quite blunt. We haven't quite ground this edge part down far enough yet. Once you've got a burr going across the whole length of the blade from both directions when you're working, that's when you know you've finally got those two edges to finally meet at a sharp point. So that's what you're looking for when you're grinding. Okay, this phase is fairly optional, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply some ferric chloride, which is quite a strong acid, to the outside of the blade. And what this is going to do, as you can see, is it's going to darken the metal. Now, this is the same acid that is generally used in Damascus steel in order to bring out the pattern. But all I'm doing this for is it just gives the axe a little bit more of an authentic sort of hand forged look to some degree. It takes a little bit of the sheen off it, and it'll give us a nice bit of contrast between the polished edge once we get the edge on there and the rest of the blade. So I'm just going to apply that. And then I'm just going to leave the axe in the vise for a bit, just to let the acid do its job. Okay, so we've created this nice sort of matte finish to the axe now. So what I'm going to do next is just put a polish on the blade, and that'll give it a nice little bit of contrast between the edge of the blade and the main head. There we go, we've got a nice little polished edge. I mean, it's reasonably sharp already and we haven't even started sharpening it yet, so let's move on to the handle. Okay, the easiest way I've found for taking the varnish off of these is to use a tool called a cabinet scraper. Now these come in a series of different shapes, and they're essentially just flat pieces of metal with a really sharp right angle edge to them, and they are literally just used for shaving very, very fine slivers of wood off of things. So it's a very quick and easy way of taking the varnish and the paint off of these. It's much quicker than something like sandpaper, which tends to clog very, very easily. These things make fairly short work of the varnish and the paint. Okay, that's the worst of it off. That's all the varnish off. The only bit is the little bit left on the end, which I'm going to do on the grinder. Again, you could do that on a belt sander. It's just quicker to do the end that way. But all that horrible varnish and paint is stripped off, and we've already got ourselves a much better looking axe. So I'll finish this off and then we'll have a look at what we can do next with the handle. Okay, so I'm using a 6mm bit to drill the lanyard hole. So I'm going to start with the basic hole nice and slowly. Obviously try and keep your drill as upright as possible. Don't apply too much pressure, because you don't want to split the grain on the other side of the wood. So just nice and gently. There we go. No split offs, no running. We're going to put a countersink in here now. That'll just help for feeding the lanyard through. And it also just tidies the edges off. Okay, so that's our lanyard hold sorted. Okay, now I'm going to scorch the handle. Again, this isn't necessarily something you have to do, but I like the way it finishes off an axe. It gives it a very nice look. I'm using MAP gas for this with a simple blowtorch head. Again, these are fairly easy and cheap to pick up, places like eBay and stuff like that, and it's a very handy bit of kit to have. Okay, so we'll fire this up and get it started. Okay, so we're going to put a final edge on the axe, and then we're going to oil the handle and the head, and we're good. Okay, this is a Japanese water stone. This one is a 2000 grit, which is more than enough for putting an edge on an axe. These use water to create a suspension medium, so that the grit from the stone creates a kind of paste on the surface. So we're just going to put a final polish on this axe, make sure that the stone stays wet. I'm going to put a final polish on this axe, final kind of edge on it, and then we'll see how it cuts. So it's important when you're doing this that you keep your angle consistent that you're using. If you start to dip it up and down, or you roll the edge, you're going to lose the edge, and it doesn't matter really if you go away from the edge or towards the edge, but you're looking at getting that nice consistent angle. And this grey that you can see on the stone here, this is metal coming off the blade. Now you don't necessarily need to use expensive Japanese water stones to get your edge. Before I got these, I used to use a piece of wet and dry, 1500 grit wet and dry on a block of wood, and that worked just as well. Well, maybe not quite as well, but it still was a perfectly serviceable way of creating an edge. Right, bearing in mind how incredibly ridiculously blunt this thing was when we first started, I reckon now that we've got a pretty good edge on this. Okay, the last part of the process of finishing the axe here is I'm just going to put a little bit of linseed oil on the handle. This will help to preserve it and seal it against moisture and stuff like that. I'm going to be using oilseed linseed oil because that's what I happen to have on me, which is fine. The alternative is to use boiled linseed oil, which will actually give a slightly tougher finish. However, if you're going to do something that needs to be food safe, then you have to use raw linseed oil, because the process that the oil goes through to become boiled linseed oil leaves it slightly toxic. Anyway, so without further ado, I'm just going to apply a liberal amount of oil to the outside of the handle. Leave that now soak in and dry.